And there we go. Okay, so in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about AI tools and their impact on education, but most of the focus will be on, and get those things off the screen, most of the focus will be on ChatGPT because that's been dominating so much discussion recently in blogs on the Oz Professors Hangout and various other places. So I thought it would be good to talk a bit about that. ChatGPT is a generative AI chatbot that was launched in the end of November this past fall, and it's gotten a lot of attention. It's not entirely new. Basically, it's just an upgrade to the 2020 release of the third iteration of the GPT engine. The main difference is that it added a conversational interface so that you could correspond with it. You could ask follow-up questions and so forth. So it made it quite a bit more user-friendly, and it became available to the public. Partly, well, and the other thing that was changed is it did go through some user testing with people who were paid to test it and check for objectionable content and so forth. And it's been cleaned up a little bit because some of the early chatbots very quickly learned to be racist and engage in inappropriate behavior and so forth. It gathered data for a while up until 2021. So if you ask it anything after 2021, after I think it was early 2021, it won't be able to give you information, or let me rephrase that, it won't be able to give accurate information. It sometimes will make stuff up. If you ask directly for information for times after 2021, it will tell you that that's beyond its knowledge set. But if you ask follow-up questions, it will make up stuff about things that it knows nothing about, which is kind of interesting. But as I said, and one criticism actually is that it used some really low-wage workers in less developed countries to remove some of the inappropriate responses that it was generated, essentially to develop some rules so that it wouldn't be producing that. I do have some examples here, and I'm going to put some of the examples in the chat. Well, I'll put a link to this in the chat so you can see them. A couple of these Maggie and I did, two of them I think Maggie and I put in, and then there was a number that I put in the last few days just to illustrate this. And actually, let me jump over just to show you some examples of how it might work. But you can look at that yourself. Here's a really useful thing. Create a mission statement for a comprehensive public college. And it's done. I remember working on many committees generating mission statements or vision statements or other similar statements where where maybe 5 or 10 people would meet for months and months, wasting countless hours. And this did this in just a couple of seconds. And the types of things that we often produce don't look much different from this type of response. Just highlight a few of these. Here's one, a syllabus statement on academic integrity and AI tools. And it talks about how you can, well, it gives you a syllabus statement you could use, essentially telling students that if they're going to use these things, they must properly cite it and give credits to any sources used, and that it's subject to the same restrictions of or violations of academic integrity as any other tool might be, or any other use of any other resource might be. And here, I asked it if there's any effective ways of detecting the use of AI tools in writing, and it tells you some of the ways in which you might detect it, and so forth. And there are some tools out there that people have developed, but basically it's a bit of an arms race, so that if you use one of the detectors, it will give you a probability statement for the likelihood that it was generated by ChatGPT. However, if you ask ChatGPT to rewrite the item so that it will not be detected by the ChatGPT detectors, it's able to do so, and it comes up with a probability often close to 0. So, that's probably not a very effective way of doing it. The human review is one of the things it suggests, but when I look through a lot of these responses, they don't look much different than the types of things I see from many students. Here's an interesting application. I asked it to create an inclusive syllabus for an introductory microeconomics course. And you know, the statements that it produces are very much like many of the aspects of inclusivity it adds into the statement is not very much different than what you see recommended on many campuses' websites and so forth. And it actually looked pretty reasonable, actually. Oh, and then I asked it to just a simple economic history or history of economic thought thing to compare the theory of value and the work of Smith and Mark. And it did a fairly decent job at the level that our students might do with the, you know, with some basic knowledge and so forth. You can skim through it, but there's some interesting things that you can do just to show the regeneration that it can do in response to one. Well, here's, oh, I guess I have two mission statements there. Here, what was it? Here's a college mission statement. And then I asked it to rewrite it as a haiku and so forth. In any case, you can look through it. And what I'd recommend you do is try to connect to it. You're almost certain not be able to connect to it right now. I tried because I wanted to do a live demo of it. But what's happening is you get this message saying that it's not available now, it's at capacity. Let me just throw in a link to it. I've got a link to it here. You can find it by just searching for ChatGPT, but this is a link you can use to get to it. You have to create an account to use it, but you could create an account using one of your Gmail accounts, for example, and log in through Gmail. So it's pretty easy to create the account, and it's pretty easy to log in as long as you have your credentials saved in the browser. This is not the first thing that we've seen as something that's claimed to make education obsolete or dramatically change how we're going to be doing our business and so forth. And just some of the things that historically have aroused lots of concerns over the future of higher ed or education in general. Printed books got a lot of attention when they were first brought in because they were going to destroy human memory. Radio and television were going to be able to provide education for the masses and democratize education and be primarily at least partly a nice service of providing educational resources to all the world, or at least much of the world. Electronic calculators. I was actually in high school when that was a really big debate, whether people would ever learn how to compute square roots by hand again, now that we had calculators, for example, and how would they ever learn how to use a slide rule? And, you know, it's the internet certainly was seen as being this wonderful tool for sharing resources, sharing research and collaborations, and it is, but it also works in some ways that may not work quite as well. There were lots of debates even about introduction of word processors, because now people wouldn't have to think as carefully about their writing because they could just move things around, and you know, they don't have to be as carefully, because when you're using a manual typewriter, you had to be very careful with how you typed because correction fluid and so forth just went so far, and having to type a whole page over again was quite a bit of a pain. And similarly, there have been concerns about laptops, much more so about smartphones, tablet computers, and even Chromebooks to some extent. Social media was going to be this wonderful service to enable collaboration for people to share their research, their working papers, and so forth. And Twitter, for example, it hasn't always worked quite that way. Wikipedia generated a huge moral panic when that first came out, but that generally has settled down. MOOCs were going to be this wonderful tool to provide education to the world, and they have done that to some extent, but not quite at the same level. In each of these cases, some people saw these as something that was going to destroy education or destroy our ability to learn. You know, there was that book that was about Google. What was it? What was the title of it? There was a phrase.
Is Google making us stupid?
Yes, is Google making us stupid and so forth, that it changes our brain. But so learning anything changes your brain. Doing anything new changes your brain. That's kind of the way the brain works. But in any case, you know, each of these things brought in some really useful tools, useful services, and made life a bit easier for all of us in many ways, or at least they had that potential. And they also had some downsides, some negative sides, and have changed how we go about many things. So I think, the use of AI is going to be somewhat similar. Right now, everyone, well, not everyone, but many people are really panicking about it. And many people are also saying, this is a wonderful tool that's going to be so useful in writing and so many other applications. And it's going to have an impact in both directions, but I think the extreme views are probably a little overstated. The main thing that people are talking about is writing assignments and academic integrity, because unlike traditional forms of academic dishonesty or plagiarism specifically, you could often track down the source of the materials unless it was some type of a paid work where you hired someone to do the writing for you and they actually did the writing and didn't just plagiarize it themselves when they sent it to you. The problem with writing produced by ChatGPT is you can't really tell it very easily apart from student work by many writing prompts. Have everyone here tried ChatGPT?
With you guys.
I found the best times to try it are either early in the morning or later at night, because during the daytime, it's pretty much at capacity and it's getting millions of hits every day. But when you do, you can look at that sample output I put, and people are seeing, and you can easily find examples of questions that people are asking on Twitter, on Facebook, and on the Chronicle, Inside Higher Ed, and many other places where people are giving examples of the prompts. Some of the writing that it produces is really good. Some of it isn't so good, but the problem is you couldn't just grab some of it and do a Google search for it and find a source for it, because it is generating an output in a way that's not detectable. And each time you put the same prompt in, you get a different response. So it's not generating a one-time fixed version of a response. It's doing it on the fly, and it comes up with different results each time. And one thing that's kind of interesting is that it will sometimes make stuff up, and it doesn't handle math problems very well. And that's so much unlike our students, right? That in their writing. But specifically, one example that Maggie and I experimented with was we asked it to compare, knowing that it didn't have data beyond 2011. We asked it to compare the document mishandling allegations, or classified document mishandling allegations of Trump and the Biden administrations. And it did a pretty good job responding to Trump, and it didn't do quite as well. It gave a very vague response in terms of Biden. And then we said, well, we added to that, provide examples from 2020, late 2022, and it provided a little more detail for Trump, and it provided a little more detail about Biden, but nothing was from 2022. And it wasn't really Biden, it was someone in the State Department alleged to have mishandled some classified documents early in the term, but it wasn't very precise, but it did make that up. And if you put in math problems, it will often generate things that don't make sense from a mathematical perspective. But so people who are doing math don't have to worry about this, but there is photo math and there's all these other things that do math problems pretty nicely using AI. One thing that does perhaps make have an impact is that when you look at the output, you won't find any spelling or grammatical errors. And in fact, one of the things I asked it to do is to rewrite this, adding some spelling and grammatical errors, perhaps to make it look a little bit more like student work, and it refused to do it. So it has built-in rules that prevent it from making spelling and grammatical errors, at least at this iteration. So that's one way perhaps you could tell that. But again, if students are using Grammarly or some of the other tools out there, or Google predictive text and other things, their work might not have spelling or grammatical errors either. And they can get free accounts for Grammarly. And I mentioned that there are tools out there that will detect work, but if you ask it to rewrite its output to make it undetectable, it will do so. Now, again, the detection tools will get better, and the algorithms in this will get better in later iterations, or when other people release other artificial intelligence engines out there. And Amazon and Google have their own AI systems that just don't have the same chat interface right now, but they may in the future. So I thought maybe before I talk more, I want to share a Jamboard with you and see and get some opinions on what we might want to do with this. And yeah, there will probably be an add-on soon. And one thing right now is this is free, but it's not going to be free for long. In fact, they've announced that they're coming out with a pro version of it in the immediate future, where you can pay basically to, if you click on the link, you can go to the Jamboard, and there's just 2 questions here. Okay, I started saying, and with the paid version of it, what will happen is you're guaranteed access, so you don't ever get that message saying that they're busy right now and to come back later. And I'm not sure what else it does. I think it mostly, it doesn't limit the length of the responses. So you can get longer responses, you can do it for a longer period of time, and at least they're claiming you're going to not be blocked because it's at capacity. So at some point they'll be charging for this. And Microsoft has announced that it's investing $10 billion into OpenAI to help develop this. So it's a very well-funded group right now because it's got so much attention. So the easiest way to use the Jamboard, if you haven't before, is just to grab one of the sticky notes and type something in it and then just drop it somewhere. You can change the color of it, you can make it bigger or smaller, but I've already put my responses on here. So if you want to post anything here, it'll all be anonymous. So, no one will know who wrote what. So the first question is, what might you use to reduce concerns about this? And then the other is, how might you use this tool productively in education, either for your own use or in terms of instructional use? We're working on a Jamboard right now. I'm putting it back in the chat. And there's just 2 questions there. The first is, how might you address concerns about academic integrity? And the other question on the next page, which you get to by clicking on the top there, just ask, how might this tool be useful? I'm going to move some things up if they drop below. And if your font's small, you may want to make it just bigger so we can see them a little more easily, depending on the size of the monitors you're using. Just a little bit bigger for. Okay, a lot of good suggestions. having students to draft things and do in multiple stages, so you're giving them feedback at each stage. One way to avoid this, because at least right now, it doesn't accept input of existing work. So, the feedback you're giving them, if they turn in an initial draft that was partly or entirely from ChatGPT, they're going to have to move beyond that in the next stage. And from that point onward, it has to be their work. Although they could ask for some suggestions, which they may use, but it may actually come into the next part. Using cursive is one way around it. Having students in person do this. Tying it to material that AI engines can't find, is a good way of doing it. And there's a few examples there. Having student opinions directly in their writing, having students discuss things that was discussed in class, having them start with outlines and submit them first, and then that restrains a response, which limits the ability to use AI, except maybe for small parts of it. Again, assignments with multiple revisions. Scaffolding is good. Obscure medieval texts, actually, they're more likely to know them. Well, if it's really obscure, yes, but if it's anywhere on the web, there's a pretty good chance that we'll have access to that. Another suggestion there is simply giving credit to ChatGPT and cite it. And that's one solution that some people have used. Use it as a source and quote it and so forth, maybe, or at least note that it was generated in part based on that. Okay, now let's move to the next, and with a personal component, and have them make direct connections to their lives. Okay, good. If we go to the next page, we've got show good grammar and spelling. That's true. Citations, it doesn't handle that well. Oh, one thing, there was a note about requiring in-text citations. It will do in-text citations. It doesn't do it well, and it won't do it in a very standard format, but it will do them a little bit. So having text citations, it will at least partly do. It has found some poetry, and it will create some poetry, not necessarily very good poetry, but it will. Facilitate collaboration, increase student engagement. Yeah, when students are working together on a collaborative work, it's less likely that they do it unless they collaborate on using it instead. And having students analyze the work of ChatGPT could be a good starting point. Have them write something using ChatGPT. Or one strategy that a lot of people have suggested is give students an essay to write, then ask them to have ChatGPT write it, and then to compare the work of the two to see the relative strengths and weaknesses, perhaps, of what's being generated by AI or by their own work.
Yeah. I was thinking like allowing students to post questions to it and then kind of discuss, like you could use it that way or something.
Yeah, posing questions to it and then discussing the responses, evaluating them for accuracy, for logical structure, for the nature of the arguments they provide, and so forth. Yeah, it could be essentially a cliche generator where it's taking what it's found out there and reproducing it in somewhat different words, basically. For fun, generate some examples to look at to get brainstorming going. And that's actually a way that many people suggested. This could be used to get past writer's block. And if you're not sure how you want to phrase something, you could generate 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different statements, all of which will be different, and then use that to help you get started, to think about the different ways you might organize thoughts, and then perhaps synthesizing that using your own words and your own logic. Yeah, and it does have some sort of looking at the structure of the outline and how it's constructed, or look at have it generate text and then break down the argument into its structure for logical analysis to see what the pattern of argumentation is that it uses in making arguments. Those are all really good.
Would it be an okay thing to do for a student to like submit maybe a draft or like something like that to see like how they could improve, or is that, I don't know what that would be.
Well, it doesn't take input, so it only will respond to questions at this stage.
Okay.
There's other tools that will do that, but
John,
yes,
didn't I read that now it will actually take a draft? And I thought that I read that it would read and offer a new version of a draft.
You know, come to think of it, it might. What I haven't seen it do that, and I haven't read about that, but it will take, for example, program code and find errors in it, which means it will respond, it will analyze submissions, and it may very well. So I shouldn't have said it won't do that, but I have not seen it being used in most of the discussion so far. But I do know that it will, if you submit, say, C code or C++ code or other code, it will find problems in the structure. Or if you ask it to generate simple programs, it will do that. In fact, it will even generate viruses for you with payloads and so forth. Yeah, that's one of the things that they're probably going to restrict in the future, because they are trying to build in some rules to keep it from doing things that may not be appropriate. But if it's able to analyze programs, it should be able to analyze text. So you're probably right, and I was probably wrong on that. So yeah, so you may very well be able to have it rewrite something that you did. I haven't tried that, but that would be a great experiment to try. And we got a couple of people coming up on the podcast who actually ran a course on this last semester at the University of Mississippi, where students were exploring what the earlier release of this was capable of doing and what it wasn't, and so forth. And they were talking about various ways in which it could be used productively. Okay, so these are all really good, and you have access to this. If you think of other things, you can post it. If you want to look back and see what other people said, it's there. And I'm going to go back to the slides. And so these are the things I thought of. Pretty much all of them have been addressed, so we can go through it quickly. Discussing ethical implications, someone mentioned that. Talk about how it's important that they learn these skills, that if they're going to be able to be effective communicators and writers, they need to be able to develop that skill, and they don't do it by typing prompts necessarily into a computer. Use writing prompts that require, and that showed up in many of the responses, use writing prompts that require the use of materials that's not available to the AI tools, either more recent things or connections to, as people said, discussions in class, the students' own experiences, and similar things. Or perhaps documents that wouldn't be publicly available or readily available. It could be some, service learning projects work really nicely, for example, where people are doing things in their community based on community needs or similar things. You could have it discuss recent events. You could have it making connections between what students are learning and their own lived experience is not only something that ChatGPT can't do for students, but it's also a really useful learning tool, because the more students can connect what they're learning to their own lives, the more deeply they'll learn it, because that provides intrinsic motivation. Using narrowly scoped writing prompts that connect to things only available to students in the class. And the scaffolding that several people mentioned on the Jamboard would be really good. Or this isn't quite the same as cursive, but we could bring back some ink pots, quill or dip pens, and have students write in blue books or maybe on parchment or something, maybe manual typewriters while they're being surveilled. Or, just a general thing, which I already partly mentioned and was mentioned there, use authentic assessment, that the value of which is clear and obvious to students, that these are things they may be doing in the future, they're doing something valuable and so forth. Yeah, lead type may not be, well, I guess lead type and a printing press could work, although there may be concerns about the lead and so forth. The more we can get students to see the value of what they're learning with the assignments, the less likely it is they'll rely on these tools. Another thing that many people have suggested is the use of ungrading, specs grading, and similar things may shift the focus from students from trying to get the highest grade to improving their skills. And that might be one way in which shifting the emphasis away from grades and trying to get the highest number of points to actually skill development and improvement in their skills might be really helpful, might be a good way of shifting. A simple thing people might want to try right now, at least, is to run the writing prompts they're thinking about using in an assignment through ChatGPT to see what comes up. And if what they end up receiving looks very much like the responses that they'd like to see from students, maybe revising in a way where ChatGPT is not going to be able to provide a really good response, so that you may want to just redefine your writing requirements or your writing prompts in a way that won't generate something that students could easily use. And a simple way of putting it, or one way of thinking of it, is if we're asking students to do work that could be easily done by a computer program, maybe we're not developing the types of skills we want to see our students develop, maybe. Or that's one way of looking at it. Either that, or computers really are getting to the level of work that we expect humans to be capable of. So those were the things I put in. And some affordances. One thing that we often notice is that people adopt new tools whenever they make our lives easier. That whole list of things that people panicked about, people use because they're useful. And this has some potential for being useful. And just a few things, some of which were already mentioned. Overcoming writer's block could be helpful. Exploring a topic, as a starting point. I did mention again the time that so many of us spend in meetings arguing over phrasing and adjective choice, and how many phrases you can fit, and how many commas and semicolons we need to introduce, and so forth. And we don't see much debate over the Harvard comma in higher ed, but we could at least get a starting point to make the discussions more efficient, perhaps. Providing basic structure of documents before doing more creative work with them, so that some of the grunt work of writing perhaps could be taken out of it, so that we're able to focus on more creative expression and more higher level work, perhaps. Having alternative variations in phrasing or structure if you're getting stuck on how to express something, and just again getting multiple variations could be good. There's a lot of other AI tools out there that are pretty much become part of everyday life. DALL-E 2 is another product of OpenAI, which generates images. And that's actually a really creative one. Eric said, students in literary criticism doing textual analysis of materials from the SUNY Oswego archives, most of which have not been digitized. That's great. And also, the National Archives have lots of projects where students can digitize materials, but you could use some of the image materials in various locations that are stored online, which would not be subject would not be available to AI tools. Yeah, so that works well. DALL-E 2 generates images based on descriptions. So you give it a description of an image and it will generate that image for you. DALL-E was just announced by Microsoft. It's been around, well, they've been working on it for a while, but they have a sample where it will simulate a voice with emotional expression after receiving a 3-second sample of a person's voice. In the past, it required at least 30 minutes and sometimes 3 or 4 hours. When the person who generated the voice for Siri provided voice samples, she spent weeks providing voice samples to generate Siri. Now Microsoft is able to do something very similar in just 3 seconds. Transcription services. Otto.ai is probably one of the best known ones. It's something we've been using at SELP for about 5 years with our podcast, and it produced transcripts there. And in Zoom has a contract with Otto.ai to generate transcripts for video recordings. All of our workshop recordings, except for 2, were generated by Otto.ai. And Siri is a little more emotional recently because it has added a bit more to it. And they've also added more voices and more voice variations. These are just a few. There are hundreds of AI tools that are in regular use. Google Translate is a well-known one that's been around for a while, where it will hear a voice and then translate it into a different language, or it'll read written text and convert it into a different language. And it's much better than the early machine translation because it has built up using the data that Google has worked with using artificial intelligence. Descript is an interesting tool. I played with it actually about 3 years ago when it first came out, but it didn't work too well at the time. It's in audio editing and now actually in audio and video editing. package where it will generate a transcript. Let's say it's commonly used for podcasts. It will generate a transcript with an audio file and allow you to edit the text. It will allow you to edit the text. But what it does is it edits the audio along with that. So if you delete the word for example, from a transcript, it will remove that from the audio, and it will also remove it from the video now. If you want to move a few words, or if someone says a wrong word where they say something that's similar but not quite what they meant, or they leave out a syllable, you can type it in and it will fill it in with its sample of that person's voice, so it will sound like that person said the word. You have to get their permission in order to do that, but it does have that ability. Adobe Podcast is supposed to be able to do the same sort of thing with cleaning it up. It's available only in beta right now. In fact, they just announced a call for people to sample it. But what that will do is it will remove noise and background echo and other things from audio files. Gradescope has been around for a few years. The University of Pennsylvania uses that, Binghamton uses it, and so forth, and it grades written work, specifically or primarily in the STEM fields, but it will grade work where people are working with handwritten equations and so forth. It will scan them in and it will provide grading and so forth using artificial intelligence. Adaptive learning platforms have for a number of years all relied on artificial intelligence to generate learning paths for students. Cogbooks, Realize It, Smartcell, and Alex, and McGraw-Hill's Connect and all the other major publishers out there have some type of adaptive learning platform that work to a better, lesser degree. And there's lots of learning analytics packages that colleges have been using to look at what factors are important in determining student success. I'm not that familiar with those, so I left that blank, but there's a lot of them out there. A couple of other issues though. One is copyright, and this is probably more so with creative work, with image generation and so forth. But the way AI tools work is they go out and they sample material online, but some of the material they're working with and sampling is copyrighted artwork and so forth. It may, and similarly, some of the text that they're sampling may very well be work that is not, which is not subject to public domain or to Creative Commons releases and so forth. And one of the questions is this using other people's copyrighted work in order to generate these new products? Because it's essentially not really generating new materials, it's essentially repackaging existing materials in a new context, which will look different than the original images, but it's ultimately derived from that. And similarly, the text is derived from the words of other people. But on the other hand, copyright is a relatively recent invention. We didn't have copyright in England, or England didn't have copyright law until the early 1700s. And in the US, the first copyright law was 1790, and it only lasted for 14 years. England's law was for 28 years. So the whole notion that you own your work for a long period of time, at least, especially with the recent Mickey Mouse extension for Disney on copyright, gives people ownership of their creative work for a relatively long period of time. But, Beethoven's work was never copyrighted and so forth because copyright law did not exist at the time. And basically, anyone working in music knows that pretty much any musical pattern or chord pattern or structure has existed before. Very little work is completely new. It's all building on generations of work that others have done. And the same is true with our own work, I think, in most forms, that, we're adding bits and pieces here, but there are very few things that are completely original. There's also the issue of the cost of these services. And, one issue is, if these services become available to students, but they're really costly, there are some equity issues there in terms of, will everyone have equal access to these tools and so forth? Maybe there'll be some free alternatives out there, but it'll be interesting to see. Those are just some of the things I was thinking. I went through this pretty quickly. Well, there's actually a link to the Jamboard, but we already have that. So any other thoughts? I'm going to stop the screen share. I'm going to try to stop the screen share. Oh, you're muted, or your microphone's not working.
Oh, no. Looks like Michael had a question in the chat too. Is Surrey more emotional lately?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we really need to freak out. That's certainly true. It's an interesting tool, and it may show up in some student work, but we've often seen things show up in student work from sources that maybe we would prefer they not use. But I think there are workarounds that we can work through, and we'll learn how to adapt to this. And we may end up seeing this as a useful tool. It's probably not going to be as useful a tool as people who are really optimistic about it as this wonderful tool to help students become more effective writers, but it's probably not quite as bad as the people who write the essay saying, is a college essay dead, and so forth. I think it'll be interesting to see how it develops. Okay, and Manta?
Hi, John. I'm actually asking about quizzes in ChatGPT. Have you noticed that people can actually cheat with quizzes? The reason why I asked that question is because I was teaching a 3-week course this winter, and all the students, there were 8 students in my course, and all the students got 90% and above on all the 3 quizzes. And which was a surprise because I don't think I have become such a good instructor overnight. Neither my course has changed drastically over the years. So have you seen that?
I haven't heard very much about it being used for quizzes. I mean, if it's an online short answer question, it could very well be. Were the responses all very different?
It was actually multiple choice.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
with multiple choice, those have been pretty much easy to defeat for a few years now. It's probably more likely that they're using Chegg, or they're using Study Blue, or they're using Course Hero, or they're using some type of a chat within the class, because one of the things that's been really popular with students recently is setting up some type of a group. It could be a Discord group, it could be a Slack group, it could be something else where students will post questions and other people will submit the responses. And then if everyone's being asked the same questions, they will all be able to get them correct. So it's probably some other mechanism, I would guess, because multiple choice, I don't think it would work quite as well.
Yeah, I thought so too, but I wasn't sure about it. I mean, I'm aware of Cheggs and other Course Hero and other, or chatting with each other to discuss it. But this was something I saw only in the winter session this year, and nothing before that, because this is a course which is offered asynchronously in summer and winter all the time. So yeah.
If you use the same questions in the past, though, the questions may be out there, and if with the responses, and if one person posts that to some type of a group chat, everyone will quickly become aware of it. Or if they've been out there for a while, all you need to do is search for the question, and it will turn up in search, and that will bring people right to it. So it's multiple choice questions are a bit problematic.
So give me some answers about my questions. I do tweak, not all the quiz questions, but like if there are, let's say 75 questions, I would tweak half of them or change half of them every time. So I have to look into it, definitely. So I'll let you know what I find.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing I do is I hate doing this, but a few years ago, I signed up for a Chegg account because that's where most of our students tend to post their stuff.
Yeah.
And if you have a Chegg account, which they just raised the price, it's now $17 and change. It used to be 16 or so, 15 something. I just got billed yesterday, but if you put the question in there, if students have posted it, it will turn up immediately. And it does something very much like Amazon will do. If you like this question, you might also like this. And it will be other questions that came from the same exam because they were posted by other students in the class. Or it will say other students who viewed this question also viewed these. And you'll often see many of your questions there if that's what happened.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I wish it was a good solution there, other than the best solutions for addressing that, unfortunately, are not very inclusive. And
Yeah.
I use some tools which are not very inclusive, such as, well, I do tell students they'll get a failing grade on that category of the class. If it's a quiz grade, they'll get a 0 for the class on their quizzes if they post questions on Chegg. But one thing that's gotten a bit tougher is up until September or so, Chegg would, when you submitted the question, if you filed an honor code investigation report with them, they would tell you the email address of the student who submitted it, when they submitted it, and also the IP address they submitted it from. So it was pretty easy to track down the students, because many of them have learned that you need to use something other than your college email in order to do this, but they will submit it through the same machine that they're using in the quiz itself. So if you, in Blackboard at least, we could find the IP address of the machine they were using while they were taking it, and then you could track it down that way by just doing a sort for the IP addresses. And I've had lots of students, I've filed many academic integrity reports based on that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I did search for other classes. I mean, I can do it this year as well. I did not find my questions on Chegg. So I
Okay.
remember Liz doing an workshop on it. So that's how I became aware of all those issues and how we can deal with them. So yeah. So but I will look into ChatGPT more with quizzes. And if there is something that new comes up, I will definitely let you know.
I mean, one way of doing it, and again, it's not the most inclusive strategy, but one way of doing it is to check all the questions before you release the exam, so you know that they're not there. And then what I do, and Liz does, and a few other people in the large class, is to have question pools, so everyone's getting a different variation of the questions and so forth, equivalent questions, but different variants.
Yes.
But also limit the time that they have for their total exam, and limit them to seeing only one question at a time. And because that way, if they have, say, even I usually give weekly 20-question quizzes. I give them an hour to complete it, which gives them a fair amount of time on each question, but they can't move on to the next question until they've answered each question, which again is not something recommended for inclusive purposes. But what it means is when they post that question, they may not be able to wait long enough to get a response from someone else if it's not already there. And that tends to reduce student reliance on Chegg and other services like that.
Right, right. And because in Brightspace, as we know, if the questions are mandatory, we cannot actually make them, we cannot make them answer the question and move on to the next one.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, you can by limiting the number of questions per page.
Which is true, which is true.
And preventing backtracking. So yeah, you still have that ability.
Yeah.
Again, it's not the most inclusive strategy, and it's one that really troubles me, because I remember taking tests where sometimes I'd answer a later question and it would prompt me to remember something that would allow me to get a better answer on an earlier question. And that's prohibited, but it is prohibited for everyone. So it's equitable in that sense. But it's something I really wish I didn't have to do. But I saw such massive rates of academic integrity in introductory classes, and even in my upper level classes when we moved to remote instruction, that I had to take some steps. Because I used to leave quizzes open for at least a week and let them do them anytime without any time restrictions.
Right, right, yeah.
Other reactions on AI and uses of ChatGPT and so forth.
I had what I could try to make a quick question, John. First, I was just going to say that this does feel to me like a sort of a bigger shift than many of the kinds of technological shifts that you were rightly invoking at the beginning. This does feel to me like the first kind of stirrings of some Terminator moment, where there's this real kind of cyborg thing where artificial intelligence has evolved to a place where it will, I think it stands really to change the nature of how we produce language and discourse. It feels to me like there's, at the very least, some significant kind of warm-up function. You can take the temperature of a discussion at the very least, and have a better sense of what's been said. But I imagine that there would be all kinds of ways that it becomes more wedded to process. But anyway, what I was going to say, I at this point in the evolution of ChatGPT, it feels to me when I see the language, like I'm thinking it just in terms of detection, like there's some qualitative difference at the level of the prose. Like the prose seems really declarative, and the sentences seem not the same length, but they seem.
It seems formulaic. It seems very structured in a certain way. It has a certain feel to it. Yeah.
It feels like encyclopedia discourse, kind of, or something. There is something about the sentences that seems distinctive to me. What it doesn't seem to me to do well at this point, from the little pieces I've read, and was my question for you and for anybody else who's seen more of it than me, does it argue very well? Like, does ChatGPT construct an argument? I always feel like arguments are shaped in a way that kind of declarative discourse is not.
It's not really engaging in logical reasoning and building arguments in that sort of logical structure. It's basically taking arguments that it's seen and trying to restructure them into some sort of coherent form, which doesn't always make a lot of sense. So
yeah,
it's not quite there yet. Mm-hmm.
I agree with Michael. I think I have also noticed that the persuasion or the argumentation is not that strong. It's very dull and boring, and it is kind of like very robotic. The sentences are very robotic. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying. So that's what I have also noticed in certain sentences and certain areas.
Mm-hmm. And that is something, when they've taken samples of responses, usually 60 to 80% of people will guess that they were the product of ChatGPT. So, it's not quite at the point where it's indistinguishable from human writing, but in some things, like for a mission statement or something like that, it really doesn't look much different than the product of a committee, let's say. It may not look like the product of a very good writer, but it may look like something devised by a committee.
That your story, John, made me recall the moment when I was serving on the Intellectual Integrity Committee years ago, and we were trying to come up with a mission statement. And the first reflex was to look around online to see what had been said. And I made this sort of point of lobbying, saying, "Oh no, that's exactly what we shouldn't do." That this Intellectual Integrity Committee, where we're talking about plagiarism, we should be careful we should check to make sure we haven't used anybody else's language. And so that's totally over.
And that's exactly what ChatGPT is doing. It's looking at all those that it could find and repackaging them into some sort of generic semblance of all of those things, which captures most of the wording, phrasing, and concepts. But it's not generally something you'd want to read for fun.
Like I just typed in create a health.
Oh, you got it. So you get it up. Yeah, actually, why don't you share your screen? And
Okay.
if anyone wants to put in a prompt, we could do it, because Jessica was able to get in. I wasn't able to right before the session.
So I just told it to create a health research paper on obesity in the United States, and it's writing a whole introduction, subheaders, causes of obesity, consequences. It's going through a whole paper. As you can tell, there's no, in-text citations or things like that.
But wait until it finishes,
Mhm.
and then ask it to add citations.
Add citations, okay.
And it will. Or say add at least 5 citations.
Okay.
I also wonder if ChatGPT can actually assume the language and voice of a character, for example.
Yes, it does.
Because I've actually had students said, okay, imagine you're a crusader and you're writing home to your wife. You're writing a letter to your wife home, and then you have to use a document to sort of to write that letter home. I'm wondering, can it?
Well, I gave it an example.
Character?
I gave it an example to write a poem about Oswego's weather. And I said, do this or rephrase this in the language to resemble the language of Keats. And it did. It added some older terms and so forth. I said, rewrite it as a haiku. So it will do it to emulate the voice of particular writers or particular periods or particular groups.
If they can find it online, though. Is that
If
the,
it's- Well, it's searched billions of pages, so it's pretty much most things online it will have found if they're not blocked behind some sort of a paywall.
Yeah, so I said add citations and now it's adding citations to the paper.
So now the CDC, some publication of the CDC is in there, NIDDK, I'm not sure who that is, but they will add it at the end unless it goes beyond the length for the free thing. Mike.
I was just going to piggyback on your idea about voice, which I think Elaine's a great. I think that's a great assignment, first of all. But I think a really wonderful observation. I was going to say that I will predict that the next iteration of ChatGPT has a setting for like register, so that you can emulate the voice of I don't know, a literary magazine. You can emulate the voice of a biology journal article. You can, so that there will be, maybe not that specific, but a social sciences voice, or I think that's not, I don't see any reason why it can't do that. So
I have seen it. I have seen people ask it to rewrite things in the voice of a 6th grade student, and it will tone it down, reducing the complexity of the word choice, making the sentences shorter and so forth. I also asked it, after I asked it to rewrite something in the voice of Keats, I asked it to rewrite it as a 12-bar blues song. And it did, with a chorus and verses. It wouldn't have been a very good song, but it at least had the beats and the patterns and so forth.
if I'm not mistaken, also, I just saw an ad for Grammarly that I think you can actually use a toolbar to change the tone of an email or document to say, I'm addressing, instead of being wishy-washy to your boss, you want to be more affirming or more careful about what you say to your boss. And you can actually use a toolbar to indicate what your tone of voice would be in this email, which is both interesting and kind of disturbing at the same time.
It's a similar type of thing. Now, but it didn't provide all the citations,
Right.
and that's what happened with me too. And it may be that the paid version will, while this only provides a subset, and you have to figure out the others yourself.
Right.
But why don't you ask it to rewrite this as a poem? Just to show how it might redo things.
Oh, wow.
So Lynn, just to answer, it is being written, just to answer, you're right. The tone thing sometimes helps a lot because, when you're writing a sentence, you just sometimes don't think about the tone of it. And it really helps a lot in email. So Grammarly kind of like gives you, is it friendly? Is it confident? Is it this? Is it that? So that's helpful, actually.
Oh, wow.
Now, I don't think this is going to get published in any poetry journals,
Right.
but it did
Actually
provide a
pretty-
poem with some really simple rhyming
Right.
patterns and so forth.
Well,
Anything anyone would like to ask it?
do you want me to try and do something with tone? Or
Yeah, you could try.
you said something like 6th grade, right? Right.
Yeah, rewrite this as in the voice of a 6th grader or something like that.
Oh, is a big problem. You're right.
Now, this is
A lot
starting to
of-
look like more of the work I see at
Right,
times.
a lot of grown-up, 1 in 3 grown-ups. Yeah, 1 in 5 kids. Okay. Interesting.
Oh, and it's still doing the poem
It's still
because
doing the
that was the
poem.
last
Yeah,
prompt. It's just
'cause I didn't-
modifying
Yeah,
it.
it's so interesting. Cool.
Any other questions while we got it up and running here?
Well, you can even do your syllabus, right?
Yeah.
You could do you want me to do?
Anyone want a syllabus generated?
You could just do-
Someone on Twitter actually created a whole project and timelines with timelines and parts of the project. And I thought that was really cool.
So what would you like the project to be on?
Something for a grant writing, like a project for interventions for obesity, let's say.
Project for interventions for obesity, but a
Yeah.
grant.
Yeah,
For a grant, yeah. And let's create some deadlines. I mean, it should be able to create some deadlines. A 3-month project or a 5-month project, we can give it a,
or yeah, write a proposal for a grant. Or write a grant proposal for a grant would work.
On obesity, or
Yeah.
just or proposal, write a grant
Yeah.
proposal. Yeah.
Well, I would have put it for some purpose, but
Oh, okay.
that's okay. But this is giving you a generic grant proposal. Oh, because it ties to
It
that.
took my obesity one from before. Yeah.
Right.
Or you could do like create a grant proposal assignment or something,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
I mean, it came up with all the steps, and this month we will do this, that month we will do this. I mean, I thought that was cool.
Yeah.
I am impressed with it. You know, not the quality of the writing, but just how well it responds to prompts
Yeah.
and the modifications.
Let me
Yeah.
do like
I
Good.
also feel it can be used for translational research. For example, if I have a topic, audience, which is 8th grade students, can I actually use my topic or my content for 8th grade students? So it will easily convert it into 8th grade language
Yeah. And Lynn has said, can it also add a reflection paper?
yeah. Should we do
That is, what did you learn by writing this paper? So
right?
yeah, reflection paper
what
about,
you learned from this assignment or something.
or maybe an assignment on what?
From an assignment on wellness. I don't know.
Sure. Oh, look at that. See, it will make stuff up.
It's crazy.
Oh my, this is just disturbing on so many levels.
Is there a limit to how much we can do it in a day through ChatGPT right now because it's free?
I think there is, although I didn't run into it. The only thing I've noticed is it will not provide a full set of citations. In fact, I
Yeah.
had it cut off right in the middle of a word. And it may be a length of the response for any one question. And it does time out if you don't access it for a few minutes.
I think we should go back to oral exams.
It's a possibility. People
I'm
have
not
suggested
kidding.
that.
I
Yeah.
had oral exams and they were awful, but you had to respond to questions at that moment.
Do a college syllabus.
Yeah, I would say though, the ECHA 101 could be different. Microeconomics,
Okay.
principles of microeconomics.
There was actually an article in the New York Times last week about that, going back to oral exams. And I thought about it, but then I thought, how could you possibly do that? With 30 or 40 students in a class, if you gave them each like 15 minutes, you'd spend, weeks just giving one exam.
Or if you have 300 to 400 students.
Yeah, forget it.
That doesn't scale very well. Yeah.
No.
Here's a syllabus with course goals.
But the syllabus is pretty generic, but it has the essence that's common to most syllabi. Ooh, apparently that's a popular book. I know it's a popular one. He actually got an advance in the millions of dollars for his first edition. And it lays out the typical order and apparently
Wow.
probably the one from MathCube.
note. This is an example.
So it can do a lot. It doesn't do it extremely well. It's not terribly creative, but for a lot of basic writing, it at least provides some substance, some structure. Anything anyone would like to ask? You could ask, what is the meaning of life, and see if it comes back with 42.
Okay.
Oh, I would have been much more impressed if it came back with 42, but it's a good response though.
I think, what did Maggie have? It creating discussion questions based off of a book or something she did.
She used some of the writing prompts that she had students write about comparing two readings, a book and an article
You do
by
like
two different
create
authors.
And
And I think that one I did paste into that document.
oh wow, cool. Maybe it was
I just
only-
posted a PDF of that New York Times article.
Okay,
Hmm.
yeah, I saw that. It's really good.
Just not feasible.
Right. It doesn't scale, you know, that works fine if you have classes, even 25 or 30 maybe, but much beyond that, it would be challenging.
Does it?
I had a professor in my PhD program. Well, he did this for like his master's classes. If you missed an exam, you had to come to his office and do an oral exam. So it might work for a missed exam.
That's true, yeah.
Does it know people? So if I said, does John Kane work at SUNY Oswego? Well, no.
You could
Let's
try.
see.
One thing that a few people have done is they've asked for a biography of themselves. And some of it was correct, some of it wasn't. Todd Zakryzak did that. He's the director of the teaching center at UNC.
Oh, I am not able to verify. Don't have the most recent.
Oh, the most recent.
My knowledge cutoff is 2021, and I do not have any information about John Kane.
So because it was current.
But you
yeah.
can check the website. Interesting. So it will cut off it with certain.
It will,
if it doesn't
yeah.
know stuff, it will.
Mhm.
Yeah. Interesting. Hmm. Anyone want me to ask it anything?
I'm really impressed by it. I am a little concerned by it, you know, but I think the benefits will be greater than the cost. I hope they will be. And you know, these things, these tools are not going to go away. That students are going to be living in a world where these tools are available to everyone, and they're going to get only better over time. This is an early stage of it. You know, there has long been the Turing test of whether you can tell machines apart from people, and it's getting harder and harder to do that. At least in these particular circumstances.
For some of us of a certain age, we'll be retired before we have to worry about it.
Well, if we look at how rapidly this spread between
Oh, yeah.
November and now.
I know. I'm being facetious.
But yeah, it's certainly more of an issue for people in their 20s and 30s now in terms of what the future will bring in terms of these tools.
Sure.
Okay, well, good seeing everyone. And if you find any really good, interesting uses of this, let us know and we'll try to share them more widely.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.